My name is Dr. Ann H. Tyler, Tyler.
Dr. Tyler, what sort of doctor are you?
I'm a doctor of psychology. I have a PhD in psychology.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a practicing psychologist with a private practice. I'm affiliated with a group called the Utah Institute for Psychotherapy and Training. I'm on the professional staff at the Western Institute of Neuropsychiatry in Salt Lake City.
What do you do for the Western Institute of Neuropsychology in Salt Lake City?
I act as a consultant. I do some inpatient work. I do some supervision of residents from the University of Utah College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. I also have an adjunct professorship at the University of Utah in the Department of Educational Psychology.
And do you teach courses at the University of Utah?
I teach an occasional course on family systems therapy.
What is family systems therapy?
Family systems therapy, it's a way of evaluating and assessing families the way one looks at family interactions.
Okay. Is that the extent of your occupational activities?
Not really. I do extensive training and present workshops to a variety of people. I've presented workshops on child abuse, identification, evaluation, treatment issues of child abuse, child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, psychological maltreatment. I present to other professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, judges.
Let me interrupt you for a second before you complete who you do this training and workshopping with. Is the basic focus of your educating and training at this time in the area of family interactions and child abuse?
My basic training, or
No,
the training that I do?
The teaching that you do, the training that you do.
Well, the training that I do is primarily in the area of identification.
Of what?
Child abuse, evaluation of child abuse.
When you say evaluating child abuse, who do you evaluate?
Well, this is two-pronged. It's evaluating both the individual child, adolescent, or youth, and evaluating the family system of that child, adolescent, or young adult or youth.
Okay. So you were saying that your basic training that you give people is in identifying child abuse, evaluating child abuse.
And treatment issues.
Treating child abuse?
Treating child abuse.
And in your private practice, do you treat children, adolescents, youths, adults who were abused as children?
I do.
And approximately how many patient hours have you spent in your clinical practice treating people for child abuse related issues?
When I put a pencil to this and tried to figure it out, it turns out to be about 10,000 hours, patient hours, in my life that I have spent in this area.
Treating the effects, the after effects of child abuse?
Yes, and I don't treat that just exclusively. I also treat mood disorders, affective disorders.
And in your work with people suffering from mood disorders and affective disorders, are those linked to child abuse, or are they also caused by other things?
They're also caused by other things. And of course, it all depends upon the individual and the situation and what kinds of information that you're able to elicit and get from a very comprehensive history of the child and or the adolescent and or the adult. Very frequently, this problem does not come to one's attention until an individual is in their 20s, 30s, even 40s.
Which problem are you referring to?
The problem of child abuse or severe depression or anxiety, which disables people, those kinds of things.
And those are issues that you as a therapist have come across in people in their 20s or 30s that have not been addressed earlier in their life?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Now, with respect to the teaching that you do and the workshops, you had started to tell us to what groups or what types of people you have been called upon to teach in the area of the identification, evaluation, and treatment of child abuse. And why don't you tell us what groups and types of people you have been asked to speak to?
Well, in addition to the students, the graduate students at the University of Utah, I have presented to judicial conferences in the state of Utah. I have presented with the Attorney General's office at the American Psychological Association National Meeting in Boston, Massachusetts. I have presented at the International Congress on Child Abuse and Neglect, one conference that was held in Paris, France, another which was more recently held in Australia.
Have you been called upon to train and educate police officers who investigate abuse and family violence cases?
Yes, I have. I had a contract with the state to present to police officers and child protective service workers who do the investigations and the initial interviews of child abuse and neglect.
Have you presented in lectures and training to any state agencies?
Yes, I have.
You've mentioned
The Human Services, Family Services, Division of Family Services in Utah.
I take it you live and practice in the state of Utah.
You're right. I have presented in other states, but I primarily try to spend as much of my time in Utah.
Now, what is your educational background leading up to your doctorate in psychology?
I have a Bachelor's of Arts degree with a major in psychology, a minor in education. I have a master's degree in psychology with an emphasis upon child, youth, family assessment. I have a doctoral degree in psychology with an emphasis upon child evaluations, forensic interviewing, clinical psychology, basically.
Okay. And have you done any work postdoctoral?
Yes, I have.
And what was that?
Well, once I finished my PhD, then I did a supervised residency at a child abuse agency. I also did some work at Primary Children's Hospital, which is located in Salt Lake City, and was supervised with residency work there. And then, of course, in addition, as all licensed psychologists are required, we are required to keep our expertise updated with Utah requires 30 hours, 30 additional educational hours that must be completed within a 24-month period. And so I am constantly or consistently updating my knowledge base.
It appears from what you've told us that the emphasis throughout your professional, both educational preparation and practice, has been on the family and on children.
It has been primarily.
Have you received any governmental grants to do research or to provide treatment services to families and children?
Yes, I have.
And would you describe what those were?
In 1976, I believe it was, I had the opportunity to write a grant in association with someone from the Division of Family Services through Utah State Social Services to establish a crisis intervention service, really a crisis nursery for children and their families in an effort to look at prevention and to track that. There was a research component written with that to see.
What does that mean? You were going to do research at this?
As we opened the facility, we were also interested in looking at if child abuse could be prevented, if families were impacted early enough, if families were given the resources, if children were given the resources early in the child's life, if that would in fact prevent the long-term consequences of child abuse.
And what were, when you say a family impact, did you mean connect with people outside the family who could help them?
Yes.
And when you say if the children were given the resources, what do you mean by resources in that context?
Well, when you look at a child, particularly a young child or an individual, you assess that child, that individual, within the context of their family, within the context of their school, within the context of their community.
I mean, you try to understand.
You try to understand this individual's world because we don't live in vacuums, and we know that experiences shape how we think, how we view the world, how we behave.
Okay. And so.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Well, that's been used by somebody else. We'll get you a fresh glass.
Thank you.
Don't want to give you new experiences here that you're not ready for. Okay. When you talk about, you're talking about trying to understand this child in the context of their family, with relation to their family, their school. What were the resources, though, that this nursery shelter was going to provide that could somehow have an effect on whether there'd be continuing abuse or whether there'd be long-term effects of the abuse? Well, you used the word resources, and I just wanted to know what you meant.
Well, at this particular resource,
Doing it again.
thank you very much. We were initially able to provide only respite care. That means emergency care for the child.
You mean
And
like food and shelter and medical attention?
Food and shelter and medical attention. In addition to that, we were also committed to providing, and were able to provide, intervention for the parent.
Dr. Tyler, you're using words that I understand. They're the words of the field, but I'm trying to get them down to Webster's.
Yeah.
When you say intervention for the parent, do you mean
Support for the parent, education for the parent, referring the parent into one of our parenting groups, into one of our support groups,
Okay.
Into their own therapy, into family therapy.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
That helps. So
Sorry.
you recognize these families where children are being abused have a problem, and the way you approach the solution are support groups, education, therapy. Is that
Yes.
the basics?
I think that's the basics. I probably missed something, but I'll think of it.
Okay. So you had received a grant to establish this nursery. You got the money?
We got the money. I didn't do it alone. I can't take full credit. I had a lot of assistance and support from the community. It was a community effort.
And is it still going?
It is. We now have 8 in the state of Utah, and the model has been replicated in other parts of the country.
So other states.
Variations on the theme.
So other states have now established these kinds of crisis intervention nurseries.
That's correct.
And with respect to the research aspect of this, did the research lead to any significant or useful information about early intervention?
Well, we're continuing. We have a longitudinal study going, meaning we have a study that is continuing long-term to evaluate what happens to these children and these families as the children grow up, to see if the interventions we've provided if they help. The preliminary data looks promising. It looks as if we're doing something to help.
Now, in addition to your private practice and the teaching that you do you also contribute to the literature
I
the
do.
professional literature on child abuse?
I do. When I have time to write, I write.
And what sort of publications have you been published in?
Oh, I've been published in the International Journal on Family Violence, in the International Child Abuse Journal, in the School Psychology Review, American Psychologist, the usual academic professional journals that I read and contribute to.
And in addition to writing for these journals, are you familiar with the writings of other psychologists, psychiatrists, and professionals in the field of the identification, evaluation, and treatment of child abuse?
Yes, I am.
And is that one of the things that you devote your 30 hours every 24 months to keeping current on?
That's correct.
You currently have a private practice, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Are you currently treating adolescent victims of child abuse?
I am.
Are you treating adults who were child and adolescent victims
I am.
of child abuse?
Yes.
Have you, in addition to treating victims of child abuse, have you done evaluations of individuals to see if they meet the criteria of abused as children persons for courts? In other words, have you done forensic evaluations?
That's a very complex question that can't be answered with a yes or a no.
Okay, well, let me ask
Because-
you. What? Sorry.
That assumes, the way I'm interpreting it in my head, it assumes that child abuse is a diagnosis of a mental illness, and it's not. It's
That's not what I meant. I mean, have
Okay.
you done work, first of all, have you testified before in court?
oh yes,
Have you been qualified as an expert witness?
yes
in
I
courts?
have
And how many times have you qualified as an expert witness?
many times.
And what was the area of your testimony, basically? What was the topic of your testimony?
The topic of my testimony was the evaluation. Typically, it's the evaluation of an individual's statement as to the fact that they had been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that was my convoluted question, that you have done that in other cases.
I have.
And in those cases, when you have done that, have you solely appeared on behalf of one side or the other side in litigation? In other words, are you always, say in civil cases, a plaintiff's expert, or are you always a
Oh, no.
defense expert?
No, I'm often asked as a friend of the court
I mean,
to,
for the court's
for
benefit.
the court's benefit, to examine the situation
And
and
what-
give an opinion.
Okay, and are you sometimes asked by one side or the other of
I am.
the adversary?
Yes, I am.
And have you been involved in both civil and criminal cases?
I have.
Have you been involved in other kinds of cases? Domestic, dependency, those kinds of cases?
No, it's primarily abuse cases.
Have you ever been involved in doing an evaluation of the family for divorce court for custody issues?
Yes, I have.
And that dealt with whether or not there was abuse occurring? to a
Not
child?
always, sometimes, but not always.
So you have testified or done evaluations in domestic court as well, or what we
Yes, I
call
have.
family law court
Yes,
here
I
in
have.
California. How many criminal cases have you been involved with?
I can't answer that question. Quite a few.
More than 5?
Yes.
And more than 10?
Yes.
Can you give me a ballpark so I don't have to keep going up in increments here?
Well, I can tell you that this year, which is what my memory serves me on the stand, I have been involved in 3 cases. I will have been involved in 3 cases. They take a lot of my private practice time, so it's difficult for me to do many of these.
Okay. Have you been involved on both as a witness for the prosecution and the defense?
Yes, I have.
And in what kinds of cases were you involved as an expert for the prosecution?
Where I was asked to evaluate child abuse, typically.
My question is, though, what were the charges? Do you recall what kinds of cases? Were they child abuse cases?
They were child abuse cases. The charges were that the child had been abused either by someone outside the home, but more, my clinical experience is more typically, I've been asked to evaluate incest situations, incest cases,
And so you were,
where the abuse occurs within the family.
so you have been an expert for the prosecution in cases involving child abuse. Is that sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse as well?
It's other kinds of abuses as well.
Now, how did you become involved in this particular case? Was it the usual way, someone just, either a court or a litigant just called you up and said, hey, I've heard of you and I want you to work on this case?
Oh, no.
So this was different?
This was very different. I was asked to do this as a member of a consortium, a national consortium that I contribute my time to.
What's the name of the consortium?
Overall,
The name of the consortium is the Psychological Maltreatment Consortium.
And what kinds of people belong? Consortium tells me it's a group of people.
It's a group of people. It's a group of 13 professionals. Some are psychologists. Some are attorneys. There are 13. I said that. It was formed in early 1991, late 1990. And it comes from the Office for the Study of Psychological Maltreatment, which is located at Purdue University and at the University of Indianapolis, in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Now, the Office for the Study of Psychological Maltreatment, is that a research organization?
It's the study of for the psychological rights of the child. I back up. That's what the name of the consortium is. And we study psychological maltreatment
Okay, for the psychological rights of the
of
child.
the child.
Now, what was the purpose, as you understand it, of putting together this group of 13 professionals into this consortium? What was the consortium's tasks?
Sustain.
I mean, how did this consortium, formed from the Office for the Study of the Psychological Rights of the Child, have anything to do with your getting involved in this criminal case?
Overall.
This consortium was sent a number of cases from various parts in the country to look at and evaluate as a group to see if we thought that psychological maltreatment was likely to have occurred and likely to have had an influence on individuals' lives.
Excuse me, Your Honor. Can we take a break?
You need some time?
I need to sit down. I'm just dizzy. I'm just dizzy.
Okay. All right, we'll take a recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume at 1:30.
Skating for over 45 years has taken a toll on my body. I take Cunol turmeric because it helps with healthy joints and inflammation support. Why Cunol? It has superior absorption compared to regular turmeric. Cunol, the brand I trust.
The participants are present except for Lyle Menendez. All other parties are present. We'll discuss a few matters before we resume. First of all, you okay?
I'm having dizzy spells. I don't know why. I was going to ask the court's permission to examine from here.
Of course. And you let me know if you need a break.
I don't know what it is. I don't feel I'm getting sick, but I'm just dizzy. And I ate. I did everything everybody advised me to do, but it might just be stress and other things that I'm having that time to deal with. So
Or you let me know if you need a break.
I will, Judge. Thank you very much.
All right. There were some matters that council wanted to discuss before we resume with the jury. One thing, Ms. Abramson pointed out to me that there was some effort by the media or one member of the media to interview the witness either in the courtroom after the recess or in the hallway. And the court's order in that regard has been very specific that there be no such efforts to interview any participants in this trial in the courtroom or on this floor. And that those interviews should be conducted in designated places. If people can't comply with those rules, then they will not be permitted to have their assigned seat in the courtroom as they have previously. In regards to other matters here, we did discuss briefly some issues at the sidebar before the witness testified. One of them had to do with the charts that have been shown to the court, and the people had objections to them. Did the defense intend to use them during the examination of the witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Really to illustrate her testimony, those charts represent the 6 major categories or major forms of psychological maltreatment as reflected in the research and the literature. And so it's really a guide to the witness's testimony and really to let the jury understand what kinds of behaviors are encompassed in the labels, the 6 labels or types of psychological maltreatment.
Is she going to testify regarding each of these and all the data contained in each chart?
Well, she's going to testify using, I don't think she's going to read the charts or say every word that's on the charts, no. I think what she's going to do is indicate that these are the major forms, and then what we're going to do is indicate how there are case-specific facts that fit into these categories.
Did you intend to introduce these charts as exhibits or just refer to them during her
I
testimony?
just refer to them during her testimony.
It seems to me that this use of charts really is for the purpose of argument and should be reserved for that purpose, and rather than during the testimony of a witness. And therefore, the court will sustain the objection that they're really, if they contain everything the witness says, then they'd be repetitive of what she says. If they don't contain everything she says, then it would not be admissible evidence because it would be something that has not been proved.
They're just a teaching device so that the jury can understand her testimony, because people learn better visually than orally. Not just my client, but all people learn better visually than orally. And it just helps us get through the testimony without having to have her read the same kind of information from a smaller form of the same chart. And it helps the jury understand what's encompassed under these categories. It's no different than any other. It's no different than a diagram of the house.
Oh, yes,
The
it is.
officer could test
It
it.
is.
Well, not a non-scale. We had diagrams that weren't scale.
All right, this is a view that I have of this matter. I would and have ruled many times in the past in the same way, that this is not proper demonstrative evidence. It's really usable by counsel in argument, and certainly if supported by the evidence during the course of the trial, can be used by you during your argument to the jury at the close of the case.
Another thing the witness intends to do, Your Honor, again, to illustrate her testimony and to make points, is to draw on paper lists of incidents and facts that support the categorizations that she makes of the nature of psychological maltreatment in this family.
You can summarize things and put them on a chart in relationship to her testimony here as far as
Yes.
what has occurred. Well, that's a separate issue. I'm not ruling on that at this stage. I'm ruling on these prepared charts that clearly are argumentative and would be best suited for that purpose. And under my discretionary decision here, I rule that it's not usable during the testimony of the witness.
May I be heard on this, since obviously it has some impact on me. Number one, they're my charts, and I designed them.
They're great. They really look good.
Thank you very much. At least someone will get to see them. That's important.
Well, the jury could see them if they're supported by evidence during your argument.
The point that I wish to make with regard to this is that, as the court knows from seeing them, there is one that has just the 6 categories. My expert and I are the ones that put these together, because those are the 6 recognized categories. And then the subsequent charts define each of the categories and give examples. And so it would be, just because I'm concerned about being bound by the same ruling as I assume would apply to the Eric Menendez jury, we would like at a minimum to be able to use the chart that says psychological maltreatment and has the 6 identified categories. There's nothing argumentative about that. There's no definition. There are no examples given.
Is an expert going to testify as to each and every one of those?
Yes.
As to each?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll permit that one, but not any of the others.
Thanks.
All right. And as far as other matters that were discussed at the sidebar here, there was some objections by the prosecution to what the prosecution assumed would be some evidence elicited from this witness. Did you want to pursue that? You had certain specific objections.
There's one specific thing I wanted to bring up, and that is, it's my understanding that she's going to discuss the psychological maltreatment of the defendants. And I'm wondering if this is going to be tied into their perceptions on the night of the crime, which is the kind of testimony that I anticipated analogizing to evidence code section 1107. Now, I believe, and I could be wrong, but Ms. Abramson indicated yesterday that she's not going to be talking about the homicides. Is that?
Well, I don't want to be accused of using cumulative evidence. So this particular expert is not going to talk about the homicides. She's going to talk about what kind of person, in effect, Eric Menendez was as a consequence of the psychological maltreatment he suffered as a child, and how the kinds of perceptions such a person would have. But she is not going to link this directly to the homicides. Another expert is going to do that. And that's so that we are not accused of putting on cumulative testimony. The expert who is going to link that is Ann Burgess, who will be testifying tomorrow.
Right. In regards to the people's objections, number one, the expert would not be permitted to testify unless there was a hearing and some ruling to the contrary regarding what the defendant did or did not perceive at any particular time. and would not be permitted to testify as far as the capacity to perceive. Those are issues that are to be litigated if the defense intends to offer those, as well as one other aspect that the expert would not be permitted to testify, and that is as to what a reasonable person would perceive or a reasonable person would do under any set of circumstances. These are not matters that would be permitted. All right. But if the defense intends to seek to introduce any such evidence, it would require a hearing prior to your offer. And also, the people had articulated some objection in regards to whether the witness would testify regarding whether or not the defendant fell within the category of battered child syndrome, or however you want to characterize it.
Actually, battered child syndrome is a physical diagnosis.
Whatever the
I don't think there is really.
nomenclature, assuming there was something similar to the battered woman's
Correct.
syndrome.
There is.
All right.
And I think.
Well, let me hear what the people's position is as to whether or not the expert should be permitted to testify about that.
Well, I was just, from the Eris case and from the language of other cases that deal with child abuse, I think it would be improper.
Well, the Eris case said it was error for the trial court not to permit the expert to so testify.
Right, and that's why we went ahead and didn't object to it, because of the Eris case. But what I'm talking about is and the expert giving an opinion that, in her opinion, this child this defendant must have been abused.
No, that's what I said. The Eris case said it was error not to permit that evidence.
Well, my understanding was it was error not to permit the expert to testify.
Let me read you the opinion 1199. The trial court's error in excluding Dr. Walker's testimony, one, that the defendant was a battered woman based on the expert's psychological evaluation of the defendant, and two, explaining how the psychological impact of being a battered woman affected her perception of danger at the time she shot her husband. So the appellate court found that was error, and in the context of that case found it was not prejudicial and not basis of a reversal. But if you read the opinion, it is quite clear that the appellate court felt that that evidence was admissible and not admissible to prove whether or not the individual was battered. But as the appellate court said at page 1199, the preceding paragraph, quote, but to prove the defendant genuinely perceived imminent danger and a need to kill the victim, end quote.
So would the court be amenable to instructing the juror that this testimony, categorizing them as such, is limited to the strictures of Eris?
Well, I'm not going to do that now because it would have no meaning to the jury now, but I'll certainly give the jury the appropriate instructions at the time when I instruct them. But giving them instructions on reasonable belief and objective versus subjective beliefs at this stage would be gobbledygook for the jury. They wouldn't know what the subject was because it hasn't been fully set out in all the other instructions that the court will give the jury at the end of the case.
Dr. Tyler is not going to be testifying as to their mental state. I'm wondering if, in fact, her testimony then is relevant. I mean, because the issue is really what was their mental state on the night in question. And it appears that she's not going to be addressing that particular issue. And the other thing is that under Evidence Code Section 723, we are going to object to the fact that there are 4 experts testifying for Eric Menendez. And therefore, it's cumulative.
Well, at one point or another, it could be, but they have to start somewhere. And they're making a choice as to which witnesses to call. I have no idea who the other witnesses will be other than what was just said regarding witness Burgess. And I don't know who else will be testifying and as to what else they will say.
There are 2 other experts scheduled. That would be Dr. Vickery and Dr. Maloney.
Well,
So I'm just saying that at some point we are going to be making an objection under Evidence Code 723.
all right.
At some point,
And
maybe you'll have a basis for it. At some point, maybe you
we'll have
won't.
to deal with that when the issue arises. The defense is on notice of your potential position in that regard. Anything else now before we resume? Okay, then let's proceed with the testimony here. If you might move your microphone a little bit so that then we'll be able to hear you.
One of my favorite supplements is Cunol turmeric. Turmeric helps with healthy joints and inflammation support, and Cunol has the #1 doctor recommended form of turmeric. Cunol, the brand I trust.
The jury panel is back and we're ready to resume. Witness is still on the witness stand. You may continue your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'll remain here.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, we were talking about this national consortium as being the originating agency that you were involved with that got you to be here today testifying in this case. Okay. Now, you testified, I believe, that several case histories were submitted to this group for some purpose.
There were 4 cases submitted to this group with just some facts about the history of the individuals involved.
Okay, my question is, were these 4 case histories or 4 court cases? I mean, how were they presented to the group?
They were presented to the group as 4 case histories.
Family histories.
Family histories.
All right. And did you know who the people were on each of these cases?
No, we did not. It was blind analysis of each of the cases.
So these 4 case histories were submitted for blind analysis by
Correct.
members of the consortium?
That's correct.
Now, did all 13 members consult on all of the cases, or were there subgroups?
There were subgroups.
And were you on the subgroup that was evaluating what turned out to be, as you later learned, the Menendez family?
I was.
And who were the other members of the consortium that were involved in the evaluation of what you later learned was the Menendez family case history?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Now, you had indicated that the members of the consortium, most of them are psychologists.
That's correct.
And are they psychologists specializing in a particular area?
Yes.
And what area are they specialists in?
Child development, child abuse, child maltreatment.
And are they people who have done research and published extensively and lectured extensively?
Objection irrelevant.
Overall.
Yes, they are.
Are they people recognized as national experts, leading experts in these fields?
They are.
And I believe you indicated that the cases that were sent, the consortium subgroups determined that 2 of these cases did meet the standards and guidelines for psychological maltreatment, child abuse.
Yes, that is correct.
And was this case one of those 2 cases?
This was.
And at some point after this initial evaluation was made, did you learn, you and the other members of the consortium, that this family history had to do with a homicide case involving the Menendez family?
At the second meeting, we learned that it had to do with a homicide case. We still had no identifying data as to name, place, only age of the individuals involved.
Okay.
And sex, age and sex.
And was a decision made at some point that to do an appropriate evaluation and analysis, members of the consortium would have to meet with each of the children of this family as it was presented to you in order to evaluate them in person?
Once it was decided that the case met the criteria in the opinion of the subgroup of the consortium. Yes.
Met the criteria for,
Psychological maltreatment.
okay, and were two members of the subgroup of the consortium then determined to be the appropriate people to then come to Los Angeles and meet with Eric and Lyle Menendez and evaluate them in person?
That is correct.
And were you selected by the consortium to do that evaluation for Eric Menendez?
Yes.
And who was selected by the consortium to do the evaluation for Lyle Menendez?
Dr. Stuart Hart.
And who is Dr. Hart in the context of the consortium?
Dr. Stuart Hart is the director of the Office for the Study of the Rights of Psychological Maltreatment.
And did you then, subsequent to those decisions, come to Los Angeles and meet with Eric Menendez?
I did.
And have you come and met with him on more than one occasion?
I have.
How many hours have you actually spent talking to and interviewing Eric?
Approximately 30 hours.
Now, in addition to talking to and interviewing Eric, have you reviewed materials in this case?
I have.
And can you just tell us briefly what categories, if you will, of materials you have reviewed?
I've reviewed school records. I've reviewed medical records. I have
Let me slow you down a little bit. Whose
Sorry.
school records?
Eric's school records.
Okay, whose medical records?
Eric's medical records.
Go on.
I have reviewed therapist records.
Is that Mrs. Menendez?
Mrs. Menendez.
And did that include Dr. Summerfield, Dr. Cox, Dr. Emery?
Emery, yes.
Okay, what else?
I have reviewed witness interviews, family,
You mean under witness interviews though, with family members?
family members,
Who else? Teachers, coaches?
coaches, teachers, more coaches, more teachers,
Lots of coaches and teachers.
coaches and
Friends,
teachers.
neighbors,
Friends, neighbors,
business associates of
business associates, interviews.
Okay, let me ask you approximately how many hours, this is before the trial began. Did you do the reading that you've just described before the trial began?
I did.
And approximately how many hours, if you will, or pages, if you know it that way, of interviews, notes, and records did you review before the trial even began?
It's a difficult estimate. I have a room that's been consumed by information, thousands of pages.
Now, since the trial began, have you also received copies of the transcripts that the reporters make up of the testimony of numerous witnesses in this case?
Yes, I have.
Have you, first of all, received and read the testimony of one L. Jerome Oziel?
Yes, I have.
Did you also read the testimony of the witnesses called by the defense, family members, coaches, teachers, friends, neighbors, those people?
I have. Yes.
Did you also read the entire testimony of Lyle Menendez?
Yes, I did.
Did you read the entire testimony that you didn't actually hear of Eric Menendez?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, this morning, did you receive some additional information from a place called the Lewis Clinic and School in Princeton, New Jersey?
I did. I had an opportunity to briefly review that.
Now, having arrived at being an expert in this case through this consortium, did you consult with the other consortium members as you were reading and absorbing all this information about the Menendez family and the case?
Yes, I have.
Now, is it your understanding that it's your purpose as an expert to address one aspect of the Menendez family system?
Yes, that is my understanding.
And what aspect of what we'll call the Menendez family system are you to address?
The psychological maltreatment issues.
Now, we have a chart, Your Honor. I'd like to mark this next in order. 295. Thank you.
All right.
And if I can have the assistance of one of the veterans.
Sure.
Can you see that, Dr. Tyler?
I can.
Yeah, Dr. Tyler, was the consortium involved at all in refining standards and the guidelines for defining what behaviors inside a family constitute psychological maltreatment?
Yes, we did.
It's easier if you point it directly at you. Right. And what I've done is put up on the board a chart entitled Psychological Maltreatment. What are those 6 things that are listed underneath psychological maltreatment on that chart?
Rejecting,
And
degrading.
I don't mean to read it, but are those categories of some kind?
This, yes, there is an operational definition of psychological maltreatment. These are the 6 categories that are define what psychological maltreatment is.
Are these categories of behavior by caregivers or parents towards children?
Psychological maltreatment is essentially a repeated pattern of behaviors
By big people towards little people?
by caretakers or others, by adults, by people
Towards
towards children that convey, the behaviors convey a message to that individual that somehow they are flawed, they are not worthy, there's something wrong with them. They are there only to meet the needs of the individual who is doing the behavior.
For simplicity's sake, given the participants in this particular family, instead of using individual, could we talk about the person who is doing the maltreating as the parents and the people who are receiving it as the children?
Yes, we could.
Okay.
I will.
In this particular case history, in your opinion, were the parents, Jose and Mary Louise Menendez, psychologically abusive towards the children, Joseph Lyle and Eric Menendez?
Yes, that is my belief. That is my opinion.
Now, these 6 categories, are these categories of behaviors by the parents?
They are.
And do each of these categories convey a particular message to a child who is the recipient of such behaviors?
Yes.
And is the message a message about the parent or a message about the child or both?
It's a message about both.
Okay. And for example, why don't we start with the first one? The first category is what?
Rejecting, degrading.
Rather than talk about the Menendez family for a moment, could you give us just a simple example of parental rejecting, degrading behavior? Just an example.
I wish you were never born. You're stupid.
Okay. Now, we're talking about, strike that. Psychological maltreatment is a type of child abuse.
Yes, it is.
And you, based on your background as a psychologist involved in child abuse, in the earlier part of your career, did you focus more on physical abuse and then sexual abuse of children as forms of child abuse?
Yes, I did.
And is there now some interest and research and a lot of literature being generated about this kind of child abuse, psychological maltreatment?
Yes, psychological maltreatment is considered to be the core issue in almost all abuse.
And why is that?
Because it gives the child a message about who they are. It has to do with their sense of self, their sense of worth.
Okay, well, let's just let me give you let's say you smack your child and say you slap him to the ground. That gives him a message, doesn't it?
Yes.
And what's the message that you get from that kind of physical abuse?
Well, there could be a variety of messages. I think the important thing is that maltreatment is not an isolated issue. It's a repeated pattern.
But my point is, when you physically abuse a child, does
Yes.
the child get a psychological message?
Yes.
That he's worthless, that he isn't loved, that kind of thing?
That he's not okay, or that his action is not okay, his behavior is not okay.
Okay. Can you do the same thing to a child with just words and other behaviors that you can do to them by punching them or hitting them?
Oh, yes.
And is it the punch in physical abuse that causes the long-term damage to children, or is it the message?
It's the message. Bones heal. Minds do not often.
All right. Now, every parent, wouldn't you agree, has at some time in those long and terrible years said something negative to their child, called them stupid, called them dummy, said, I hope you have 6 like you, or I wish you weren't born. I mean, nobody's perfect. Is that
I
right?
think we all have as parents. There isn't a perfect parent.
Okay. Now, if you were to take a knife and stab your child through the stomach once and never do another thing to them, that would still be a serious traumatic episode, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes.
If you were to once call your child stupid or dummy or jerk, would that be a serious event?
Isolated, you only did it once, wasn't built on any other
Right.
maltreatment. Is it serious? Probably not if it's one incident.
Children are somewhat resilient, aren't
Yes,
they?
children are.
Life is full of slings and arrows. We can get over some
correct.
insults, can't we? What then makes calling a child stupid or dummy or wishing they were never born just as verbal negatives, what makes that a form of child abuse rather than just bad manners on the part of a parent?
Well, it sends over a period of time, if the pattern is repeated, it conveys to the child, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy that if you tell me enough times that I'm stupid, I'm going to believe that I am and that I cannot do anything about it, that I am maybe helpless in my stupidity.
Does it therefore affect the way a child develops if you give them these negative messages?
That is the important part of psychological maltreatment of children, is it does impact their emotional development, their mental development, and their development of being able to relate interpersonally to the world that they know.
So it affects how they feel about themselves.
Yes,
It affects their abilities to perform in life.
yes,
And it affects their ability to have decent relationships with other people.
it does. It affects their ability to perform in school. And this is all supported by research.
Now, we've just been talking about this first category, rejecting, degrading. I guess the simplest examples are name-calling type behaviors. Is that right?
Yes,
Now, moving on to terrorizing, which includes endangering. What is just, again, not necessarily from this case, but what is a simple example of terrorizing behavior of a child by a parent?
locking a child in a closet that's dark with no light and no way to get out.
Okay. And what does those kinds of behaviors that are terrorizing, what message does that give the child?
Well, when a child is terrorized, they develop an incredible fear. And if a child is terrorized enough, they become fearful of many, many things. And often fear then leads into extreme anxiety, anxious behavior.
Okay.
It's hard to think when you're fearful, when you're anxious.
What's it like to be a person who's chronically fearful or chronically anxious? What does it feel like to be that person?
Section calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
Yeah, I mean, based on the research and the study of particularly of children and there is recent research, isn't there, about how children think and how children feel and finding ways to communicate with children to find these things out.
Yes.
So what does it feel like? I mean, does a person who's fearful and anxious suffer?
Yes, they suffer. If you're terrorized, and the terror is severe enough, you feel that your life is threatened, that you may not live through this being locked in the closet.
Okay. Now, one episode of locking in the closet would not be nice, but would that necessarily result in a child who is chronically fearful or anxious or terrorized or afraid of dying?
Something like that, if they're left for any period of time, could really set quite a good basis for that child, for additional terrorization. So again, I talk about the cumulative effect, the repeated pattern.
In order for you or the other members of the consortium or for any reasonable researcher or clinician in the field to come up with a evaluation of psychological maltreatment, must there be evidence of persistent or chronic or repeated episodes of coming in any of these 6 categories? I mean, does it require that before you would ever say that a case history indicated psychological
Yes, that's the definition of psychological maltreatment. It is a repeated pattern of behaviors.
It isn't just one of these and one of those.
No, it's not one of these and one of those. And it's over a period of time. And there have to be observable consequences, observable effects at school, at home, with peers, with...
You mean effects that show up in the behavior of the child?
In the behavior, in the way the child perceives his world, he thinks, in the child's feelings, in the way the child performs at school, across the board.
So even if you had information that the parents in a particular family or a parent was calling names, was terrorizing, and we'll get to the other ones too, was doing these things, unless you saw some evidence of the effect on the child, would you withhold the determination that there had been psychological maltreatment?
Depends on when we're asked to make the determination.
What do you mean by that?
Sometimes, as a psychologist, you are asked to evaluate a child where perhaps a teacher has noticed that the parent or the caretaker has been unusually harsh with the child, or is treating the child in a way that the teacher, on the basis of her experience, would predict that there would be some consequences for this child. Now, if I'm asked to do that, to evaluate a child in that setting, hopefully I don't have to wait until there are some very serious consequences, which is the reason that we get into the family to.
Yeah, but I don't actually understand that. I mean, I realize this isn't my best day, but here's what I want to know, okay? Children, I mean, everybody's slightly different than everybody else. Is that a given? Psychologically, slightly different.
That's the one generalization we can make about people is they're all different. Yes.
And inside a family, some children are just innately more sensitive than others from birth, aren't they?
Children are born with different temperaments. That is correct.
And different sensitivities.
And different sensitivities.
So you could have two children in a family, say, where a mother routinely calls one stupid and dummy and idiot, and it just, you never see any effect on that child. They don't report bad feelings or sad feelings. That doesn't seem to influence their behavior. It doesn't seem to influence their school performance. You just can't find any effects. And another child in the family where the mother does the same thing, and that child is withdrawn and has school problems and is sad and is frightened and all these other things.
Objection, leading.
Yes, and it's also a little unintelligible. Why don't you break it down and
Thank
not
you.
lead the witness? Although she's an expert and you are permitted to do so, it's best to have her testify.
Okay.
rather than-
My point is, do you just look at one half of the equation, the parental treatment, or do you look at both halves before you determine whether behavior does rise to psychological maltreatment?
We look at both halves.
Now let's go down to isolating, okay? What is the significance of isolating as a form of psychological maltreatment?
This is probably one of the consequences of isolating an individual. Probably has the most severe effects.
Okay. Why is that?
That's because if a child is maltreated and then you isolate that child from any outside help, any outside intervention, then basically you are saying to that child or placing that child in a situation where he's hopeless, he's helpless. There is no way, if a child or a system is isolated, that the individual can see that there's a way to survive, a way to get out. Does that make sense to you?
Well, let's ask another question.
It's not whether it makes sense to me. It's
Questions will be asked by counsel.
all right. Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, let me. I think you've indicated that when a child is abused, they suffer. Is that right?
I've indicated that, yes.
Now, you had talked about earlier the fact that you helped to establish through your grant writing this crisis intervention nursery,
That's correct.
where certain support was brought to abused children and their families.
That's correct.
When you talk about isolating as a form of maltreatment, do you mean physically keeping a child locked inside a room or in a house far away in the woods where no one else can ever see what's going on? I mean, what does isolating mean?
Well, isolating means the things that you've just talked about. It also means, perhaps more importantly, you isolate the individual from having relationships that with other people. You isolate the intimate relationships you isolate the individual by, for instance, in incest families, we see extreme isolation because the family is enmeshed and it is bound by secrecy. Therefore, that individual within that family is isolated.
And therefore, is a child who is isolated in a family where there's maltreatment likely to reach out and get help?
No, that child is not likely to reach out and get help.
Now, the next category you have is exploiting, corrupting. And what are some examples generally of exploiting, corrupting behavior that constitute psychological maltreatment?
Well, as you know, abuse of any kind operates on a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look from a smack on the bum to a severe beating, from one incident to a lifetime of incidents, in exploiting and corrupting, at one end of the continuum, it would be maybe insisting that your child go into a particular career for a period of time, or participate in a particular sport for a short period of time. Using the child to meet your own needs. That's what exploiting means. Then that definition also includes missocializing, and that means giving messages to the child about simple messages like cheating, honesty. If the message you give a child is that it's okay to cheat to get to this goal, then you're missocializing the child. You are giving them the message that it's okay to cheat.
And that's corrupting, is it?
No, well, yes, it is. Corrupting is, we see it sort of at this end of the continuum where children are used for the purposes of the adults in very serious ways, such as children who are used in pornography rings, children who are sexually exploited, children who are sold into prostitution, children who are repeatedly used by the perpetrator.
Okay, now you mentioned when you first started this description of exploiting, corrupting, you said basically it's a category where an adult is using a child to meet the adult's needs.
That's correct.
All right. You also gave us examples, choosing a sport or choosing a career. Is there something wrong with that?
There's something wrong with it if it is something that the child has no choice about.
And I think you said that's the mildest end of the spectrum, like a parent telling a kid they've got to play soccer or they've got to play baseball because the parent always wanted to be a baseball star or a soccer star.
Or having a little girl go into modeling because the mother always wanted to be a model, and so she has a 3-year-old being photographed and that kind of thing. And that can be an exploitive experience for a child. Yes.
Does the child experience it as exploitation? I mean, does the child know they're being exploited, or do they know they're being forced? I mean, is there a message there?
It depends upon the developmental age. And we look at all of these definitions of psychological maltreatment within a developmental context.
What do you mean by whose developmental age?
The child's developmental age.
And could you just give us quickly, what are the significant developmental age brackets?
Yes, 0 to 2.
Okay, and what's the next one?
And 2 to 6.
And the next?
6 to 11.
Okay.
Then we go 13 to 18. 12 is sort of on the cusp.
Okay. And those are significant developmental ages for all children?
Yes, and then 18 to 24, if you want to take it up into young adulthood.
Okay. Now, are you saying that various kinds of behaviors in these categories are more or less severe depending on the developmental age of the child?
That is correct.
Okay. So what do we mean then with respect to, we were talking about exploiting and corrupting. You said whether or not a particular behavior will cause a message to the child depends on the developmental age.
Within each of those developmental ages that I have identified, the 0 to 2, the 2 to 6, so forth, there are developmental tasks that each one of us had to go through as children. Some make it through more easily than others, depending upon the temperament of the child. But the research shows, and this is old and continuing research, that children have certain periods of development. And those tasks, for instance, the 0 to 2 child, the task of development there is attachment to the caretaker. In our culture, it's typically the mom and the dad.
Okay.
And the task is attachment and trust. That's if I'm attached to my mom, my dad, I have the beginnings of what we call basic trust.
So how do these things impact? Let's say we take someone who's in that early stage when attachment is the key, okay?
Yes.
Are there things on that list that would impact even a 0 to 2-year-old?
Yes.
My question was
There
whether-
are.
All right. And what are the things that would give a message even to an infant that would give them one of these negative messages?
An infant who's, when I cry, I need to be picked up. I need to be held. When I'm scared, I need somebody to hold me and reassure me.
So
Those
let me
kinds of
ask you-
things.
All right. Then let me ask you a question. If you terrorize an infant, okay, does that send a message even to the nonverbal brain of an infant, a negative message?
Absolutely.
And if an infant receives these kinds of negative messages, does it interfere with his developmental task of forming attachment and trust?
Yes, it does. If you're unable to form a trust relationship in the beginning years of life, I've seen children who play catch up for many years afterwards. It's a very basic thing. If we don't trust, we don't have anything.
Let's go back to exploiting and corrupting, okay? Let's go back to some of the behaviors that you said constituted exploiting or corrupting. Is there a particular developmental age when exploiting, corrupting maltreatment sends the most powerful message or interferes the most with developmental tasks?
All of these definitions impact every developmental level. And how it impacts the level is dependent really upon the task of the level. In other words, and if the child from 0 to 2 doesn't trust anybody, and then they hit 2 to 6, where the task is really becoming more independent from mom and dad, daring to be more independent, to cross
Explore.
to explore, to move away. And if the child does not trust that they can get the caretaking that they need from mom and dad, they're going to be very reluctant to do that exploring. Because sometimes there's no attachment, but often with children we see what we call an anxious attachment, a clinging behavior, because the child is so mistrustful.
When you see the clinging behavior, let's say in a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, Does that give you some reason to believe that there was problems in the attachment stage and now there's problems in this go explore stage?
Yes.
Let's go to the denying emotional needs category. Can you give us some simple example of what kinds of parental behavior constitutes denying a child's emotional needs?
I smile at you and you don't smile back. You don't acknowledge that I have feelings, that I'm trying to connect with you in a nonverbal way.
How
I
about-
cry, you don't pick me up. I have a nightmare and you ignore it, or you treat it in a way that either minimizes it and tells me that I'm not important, or maybe there's something wrong, or maybe I don't exist. Maybe there's not a me inside because I'm not getting the feedback from my environment that I need to know that I'm a person.
And if a child is frightened and a parent is critical of fear, is that meeting the child's emotional needs or denying them, or what?
Well, it's actually two forms of abuse. It's not responding to the child's need to be comforted, but it's also ridiculing it. It's degrading it, and it's saying it's not okay to be scared.
And does that kind of behavior, when a parent ridicules fear or refuses to acknowledge it or treats it, well, you'll get over it, or you've got to be tough, does that make the child less fearful because they're being told, don't be afraid, just do it? Does that make a child less fearful?
No, of course it doesn't. It only serves to make them more fearful because they never resolve.
They never resolve what?
They never resolve what it was they were frightened of. They think that maybe if it's laughed at, sometimes children are even afraid to say what they're afraid of, because the last time they told dad or mom or grandma that they were scared, and the response was, well, you're stupid. There's nothing to be afraid of. Or you need to be brave. You need to not be afraid. You need to be strong. And the message that a child gets is, there's something wrong with me because I'm scared.
And then they would tend to, you think, hide other fears?
Oh, yes. And hide and begin to maybe hide other feelings and begin to stuff all this inside.
And is it unhealthy for a child not to be able to express their fears and have them resolved, as you mentioned?
It impedes their growth, their normal development, their ability to be happy.
Let's move on for a moment to denying mental, educational, or medical needs. Is that something that used to be called neglect?
Yes.
And neglect has long been recognized as a form of child abuse, is it not?
Yes.
It's
Neglect, also incorporates the denying emotional needs.
Also, there's another category that isn't here, isn't there? There's denying physical needs. I mean, if you starve them, I guess you're maltreating them in a major way.
Objection waiting.
Yeah. Is there another category is there a psychological maltreatment component to physical neglect of children? In other words, if you don't feed them on time, if you don't clothe them adequately, if you don't keep them in a nice, warm, clean place, is that just physical maltreatment, or is there a psychological component?
Well, there's a psychological component, and I think that would probably include all of those. If you're not meeting basic needs of a child with a baby, they depend on us for their life. They depend on us to bathe them and to feed them and to provide a place for them to sleep. If we can recognize that they're sick, to get some medical help for them. So that really That babies need to be held, that babies need to have play with other people.
Is that part of denying emotional needs and denying mental, educational, or medical needs?
Yes, and I think it's also rejecting if you're not able to meet a child's needs, very basic needs. If you look at what those basic needs are, the very first few months of life, they're physical needs. They're the needs to be fed and to be burped and to be diapered and to be, and then the emotional needs.
Do little babies need to be responded to if they smile at you and you, or if they smile or if they cry and if you don't respond to them, does something happen to them, or can something happen to them?
Well, they can die. And after the Second World War, when children in England were put into orphanages, and even though the orphanage could provide the basic physical needs of these kids, and they were not being terrorized. Of course, they'd been terrorized by the war, but there weren't enough caretakers. Primarily, there were nuns that were doing the caretaking to really be able to comfort these children and to touch them and to hold them, and some of them died, and there was no physical reason.
Just for lack of emotional responsiveness?
Yes.
Now, you were talking about the developmental issues at different ages, and I'd like to turn to that. Let's start with that fundamental developmental age you talked about, 0 to 2, and what a child needs at that age.
The child needs to have their physical needs taken care of. The child needs to have their safety needs taken care of. The child has to have love and a sense of belonging.
And you said the key issue at this age, 0 to 2, is something that you called attachment.
Yes.
Now, what is attachment in the sense that you're using it?
Attachment in this way I'm using it is a child being connected with a primary caregiver, a mom, a dad, a grandma, a foster mother, somebody that the child feels protected by, and somebody the child can trust. That's it.
Now, has there been extensive research on this need of the human organism to form this early life attachment?
Oh, yes. The attachment literature is very extensive.
And if a child does not have this in their early years, if they do not form this attachment, has there been research that shows very severe consequences for later life?
Yes.
And what kinds of consequences for later life occur when there's a failure for, well, I think you talked about those babies in World War II. They died.
Some die.
And what are some of the other problems that occur when a child does not have this trusting attachment?
Well, if you can't trust that you'll be taken care of, you can't trust on very much.
And what happens if you move on through life without being able to trust anything? I take it trust with respect to other people.
That's correct.
And what happens if you can't trust people?
You're isolated.
Your Honor, could we have a brief break?
We'll resume at 3 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Let's make it 3:05.
Testified earlier that your opinion was that this was a family system in which the children were psychologically maltreated by the parents. Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
And with respect to Eric Menendez, did you find psychological maltreatment by both parents in every category listed on that chart?
Yes, I did.
Now, in formulating that opinion, was it necessary for you to evaluate this family system?
Yes, it was.
And in doing that, did you look at the different roles? Excuse me. that each member of this four-person system played within the family.
Yes, I did.
And in evaluating that, did you look to see who had the power in this family?
I did. I evaluated that.
And what was your evaluation on that issue?
Well, the parents both had the power, and while it would seem to the outside world that the father, Jose, was the most powerful, in fact, on examination, the mother was a very powerful figure in her own right. As a matter of fact, I would say that she had perhaps more power in some sense than Jose, in that she was with the children the most in the home setting, particularly in the early years. And so she had her own power as the mother, and then she also had power using Jose, who was not present, but the image of Jose as the all-powerful father, as kind of her batterer. She would threaten the children with the father's power. So she had her own, and then she also had her own plus the father's.
Now, you're aware that there's been testimony from some witnesses that, at least on appearances, Mrs. Menendez appeared to be dominated and controlled by Mr. Menendez. You're familiar with that testimony?
Yes, I am.
And there's also some evidence presented by both of the children, both Eric and Lau Menendez, that there was physical abuse of Mrs. Menendez by Mr. Menendez. And you're familiar with that evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, are you familiar with the literature and with treating battered wives?
I am.
And based on your experience in this field and your evaluation of all the materials in this case, did Mary Louise Menendez fit the typical pattern of a battered wife?
She did not.
And in that context, did she fit the typical pattern of a powerless victim in this family?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained. It's also argumentative and unfocused.
Well, may
Rephrase the
we
question.
approach?
No, rephrase the question.
All right. Were there behaviors on Kitty Menendez's part that were atypical for battered wives or wives who are totally dominated, controlled, and victimized by their husbands?
Yes, there were.
Foundation.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
Your Honor, I don't understand the objection.
All right, why don't you approach?
Thank you.
Your next question.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Tyler, you've indicated that you examined the materials concerning how Mrs. Menendez treated Eric when Mr. Menendez was not around. Is that
That's correct.
And in that respect, did you determine what her influence was from a psychological maltreatment standpoint on her son?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
I think it was apparent that Kitty Menendez was able to effectively isolate Eric, not only from his brother within the family, but from people outside of the family. She was able to terrorize him. She would lose him at shopping malls when he was a little boy. And when the security guard would call and ask to have him picked up, the reports are that she would finish her shopping and then go pick up the child.
Now, what aspects of psychological maltreatment does that particular repeated behavior demonstrate to you?
I think it addresses the rejecting. I think it addresses the denying emotional needs. And I think it's terrorizing. It's terrorizing for a child to be lost in a mall and not have anybody know where he is.
In going over all of the material in this case, did you find behaviors by Mrs. Menendez at every developmental age that fell into the category of rejecting and degrading behavior towards Eric?
Yes, I did. I did a very thorough analysis of each developmental level and pulled out incidents that would fall under each definition of psychological maltreatment. And without exception, every developmental level included each form of maltreatment, starting with age 0, when in fact it was disclosed that Mrs. Menendez had not wanted to have children at all.
And that would be every category of psychological maltreatment at every developmental age by Mrs. Menendez.
That is correct.
Now, did you also, in analyzing the family system here, assess the impact of Mr. Menendez from a psychological maltreatment standpoint?
I did.
And were there certain categories of psychological maltreatment that were more typically engaged in by Mr. Menendez than others? At least that you had more data about.
I had data about every category. Primarily, the data about Mr. Menendez had to do with terrorizing, exploiting, corrupting, and most certainly isolation. That seemed to be probably the most pervasive form of psychological maltreatment in this family. Isolation within the family, isolation from people outside the family.
When you say isolation within the family, what do you mean?
Well, an example would be when Eric would cry and his father could not stand a display of emotion. And this is corroborated by many interviews. His message to Eric was, do not tell your mother because she is my friend.
So that's an effort by Mr. Menendez to keep Eric isolated
To
from
keep Eric isolated
his
from
mother.
telling his mother when he was hurt or if he needed something.
You recall Eric's testimony that his father said to him at some point that your mother's not your friend, she's mine,
That's
therefore
correct.
don't bother telling her anything bad that I
That's
do to
correct.
you. And do you see that as a purposeful behavior by Mr. Menendez?
Yes, purposeful, intentional. It was a way in which he was able to dominate, control this child.
And do you see other examples in the family of efforts to keep the members of the family separated, non-allied with each other?
Yes, when the children were small, there was a approximately 3-year difference in age. The little boys were purposefully pitted against one another in competition, in competing with each other, fighting, to really hurt each other, not to be little brothers and to fisticuff and to wrestle, but to hurt each other.
And that has the effect
And that
of what?
separated, that isolated then Eric from his older brother Lyle. Later in years, their developmental years, Eric and Lyle came together more and were able to form more of an alliance. But in the early years, they were pitted against one another competitively. And it appeared as if Eric was pretty much not only the little brother, and all little brothers have a harder time, I think, than big brothers by birth order problems, but he was regarded in the Menendez family as the second-class citizen. He could never please. He couldn't please his father, certainly, because he wasn't as strong. He wasn't as, didn't perform as well in sports. And he could never please his mother. I'm not sure he ever gave up trying to please his mother, but there were some very significant incidents as a little guy, where he tried to bake a cake once and for her, and I think he was 6 or 7, and his mother came home and something had happened to the oven or to the cake. I'm not sure what, but it was a disaster. And the mother's response was she flew into a rage and was furious with him. And it was a very devastating event for this child. Doesn't sound devastating to us as adults, but it was very devastating to this child because it was, again, a real conscious effort on the part of the child to please his mother in a way that appeared to be impossible throughout the years.
Let me get back to, though, we were talking about Mr. Menendez. You have indicated some examples of how he did things or said things to keep Eric isolated. Did it appear from everything that you've read that Mr. Menendez subscribed to the notion divide and conquer?
Objection calls for speculation.
With respect to how he managed the family, did you see conscious efforts to keep everybody separated from everybody else except him?
Yes, it was very obvious within the family, the way he was able to achieve that. Also, Mrs. Menendez was able to achieve that in her own way. And if we're talking just about Mr. Menendez, he had intimidated, and it appears from reviewing all the interviews that I've gone over, it appears that he intimidated teachers and certainly the coaches and friends, business associates, but he also intimidated his own family, his own sisters, such that the children had no one else to turn to but to their mother or their father. They were isolated from any outside resources.
Now, you were talking before about how they were isolated within the family by such messages as your mother's not your friend, she's mine. And this, what you're talking about now, is a notion of isolation from people outside the family. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any significance that you attach to the sort of mythologizing that appears to have gone on in this family? The kinds of things like, Menendezes are superior and the fathers talk about his prowess in business. Does that have any significance on this issue of isolation?
Objection vague.
Rephrase the question.
Are you familiar with the reports, the interviews, and the testimony that Mr. Menendez would regale his sons with stories of his ruthless business dealings and his powerful connections and his notions of superiority?
I am.
Are you familiar with the testimony by him and others in interviews where he talks about the greatness of his family, their great achievements, their connections to the Romans, and other such myth-making?
Yes, I am.
And what significance, if any, does that behavior and practice on his part have?
It has tremendous significance because, in effect, what it's saying to the children is, I am omniscient, I know everything, I am all powerful, no one dares cross me. And Eric was able to see that happen within his family and outside of his family. No one dared cross. When people tried to intervene on his behalf, meaning a teacher or a coach or his aunt, they were severely chastised. They were told, this is not your business. You stay away. And they stayed away.
And based on that, and based on your contacts with Eric and your evaluation of him, in your opinion, did he believe in his father's power and omniscience and ability to control and intimidate other people?
Objection. Improper opinion.
Sustained. Your next question.
Would a child in such an environment with that kind of parental message repeated have any reason to doubt that message?
No, he would not.
And did you find support in the materials that you reviewed that Mrs. Menendez subscribed to a similar theory of familial superiority and exclusivity?
Objection waiting.
Overruled.
Mrs. Menendez was reportedly, and again, this is by reviewing interviews from a variety of witnesses. She asked the question again, please.
Okay. The question is whether you saw in those materials that Mrs. Menendez also promoted a myth of the superior exclusive family that had an isolating effect on the children.
She was primarily, according to the reports, interested in the image of the family, in her image as Kitty Menendez. And this was borne out by testimony from a variety of sources. She was said to have been interested in her child only in that his performance would serve her needs.
And what need of hers would his, I take it, positive performance or winning performance, what need of hers did that serve?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
When you have a parent whose interest in a child is to fulfill their own needs, what is the effect on the child?
The child's sense of self is badly damaged. The child feels they don't have a life. They don't deserve to have needs, to deserve to have feelings, to be able to think on their own, to be able to make choices. Eric Menendez, according to everything that I could read about his early childhood, was not even allowed to choose what he ate, what he wore, what happened to his body. He wasn't able to close his eyes and rest and be left alone.
And when that is a pattern through a child's life, when they reach adolescence, are they prepared to problem solve and make choices and go through the separation that's necessary at adolescence in a healthy way?
Absolutely not. As I indicated at the beginning of my testimony, child development here is critical. And when a child does not pass through the developmental stages, having their needs met and along the way, then we cannot expect them to achieve young adolescence, young adulthood, with the ability to have self-confidence, to make choices. It creates, with a child like Eric, it created a terrible double bind because he was forced consciously and unconsciously to be extremely dependent upon his mother and his father, extremely dependent, so that when he reached the age of, well, that age 2, when the task is to develop autonomy, meaning a toddler who starts learning about being independent, all the way up to the teenage years, when the teenager is really needing to test their independence, and all teenagers do. This child had never really mastered that 2-year-old task of knowing that he could be independent. He didn't have the skills. He didn't have the skills really mentally, and that wasn't because there was anything wrong with his brain. He was tested to be a bright child, but he didn't have those skills to problem solve. He didn't have the emotional skills. He was a very young, immature, naive. He was described by,
When you're describing him now, you're describing him at what age?
well, I'm describing him at, he was young, immature, and at every level. If you were to take him at 6, you would find teacher reports, or at 12, or at 15.
Or at 18?
Or at 18, you would find corroboration all along the way that this was a child who developmentally was not where he should be chronologically through no fault of his own. So emotionally and mentally, psychologically, he had been cut numerous times. I often use the analogy of when a person is gashed, say on the arm, one gash, you can put a Band-Aid on or mercurochrome on. 2 gashes, maybe not still very significant, but if you continue to gash that arm and you never treat, and you never pay any attention to it, and you never put salve on it, what happens? It festers, becomes infected. Sometimes it dies.
All right, but he didn't die. What you're telling us, though, is that he was emotionally, mentally, and psychologically, developmentally, not where he should have been at every age, including, I take it, the age of 18.
That is correct.
And so was he in a position then at the age of 18 to solve problems, to deal with crisis, to deal with his own emotions the way a healthy, well-developed 18-year-old would have been?
Objection calls for speculation and compound.
In part or in whole, on information concerning her own family, her parents, and what happened in that family, and what that family was like.
I did in part, yes.
Now, is it important in assessing a family to evaluate it for maltreatment, whether it's psychological or sexual or physical, to know the intergenerational history of that family?
Absolutely.
Why is what happened in the preceding generation or generations important or significant in evaluating a family?
Because this we know for a fact that abuse is generational. It is passed from generation to generation. And without some sort of intervention, some sort of outside intervention, it typically passes to the next generation. And that is borne out in the research.
Now, in your assessment and evaluation of Eric Menendez and this family, did you seek corroboration from sources apart from Eric and his brother in order to verify that what you were being told about what happened in this family, in fact, happened?
I did, with every incident, cooperate through the other witnesses, review of the other witnesses, the medical records, et cetera, et cetera.
Is the fact that there was abuse in the previous generation also corroborative that a parent would either actively engage in abusive behavior or tolerate it in their home?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Your Honor, I'd like to be heard.
All right, why don't you on something else, and we'll get it a little later on.
Are you aware from the information that you received that there were behaviors that were visited upon Kitty Menendez that she then visited upon her
Counsel,
own
let's
children?
get on to this a little later on. Go on to something else.
Now, you did an evaluation of the maltreatment that was visited upon Eric by developmental age and by each parent. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I think you said that the main components of the psychological abuse that he experienced was isolating and terrorizing.
Yes, he experienced all of them, but I think the ones that were the most striking in terms of his development were the isolating and the terrorizing. And subsumed underneath that isolation were some of these other things.
And are you familiar with the statements of witnesses and the testimony of witnesses that from a very young age on, Eric demonstrated evidence of being anxious, fearful, withdrawn, lonely, sad, emotional, all of those things?
Low self-esteem.
You're familiar with all that material?
Oh, yes.
Is that consistent with a child who's been visited by maltreatment, focusing on terrorizing and isolating?
Yes, there's very statistically significant correlates of a child who has been terrorized and isolated.
Demonstrating those kinds of personalities and behaviors?
Yes.
Now, turning to your assessment of the actual psychological maltreatment that was inflicted by these parents in Eric's childhood, why don't we try to do this by developmental age and by parent, okay?
Okay.
And with respect to the earliest period, what I propose to do, Dr. Tyler, if you're prepared to do it, is to start with Mrs. Menendez. Now, was there evidence that you discerned both from evidence in the case and from other materials that you relied on, that there was psychological abuse by the mother between the ages of 0 and 2?
Yes, there was.
And what was the first category of such abuse that you documented?
When Eric was born, under denying emotional needs, Mrs. Menendez had not wanted children. She had expressed that to more than one source. And when she was pregnant with Eric, she had expressed the desire to have a girl and had prepared for this child with buying pink things, and she wanted a little girl.
Well, how is that maltreatment of Eric since he's not born yet?
Well, it sets the unborn child up to be a disappointment, sets him up for perhaps some expectations that can never be met, sets him up for rejection.
And what other information do you have that demonstrates that Mrs. Menendez denied his emotional needs?
Well, I looked at a lot of photographs when he was a baby. And again, I talked, or I didn't talk to, but I reviewed some of the reports from the family. And this was a child who...
But what did you see in the photographs?
Well, in the photographs, this was a child who appeared to be sort of handled like a piece of baggage. I couldn't find any pictures of the mother and the child with any cuddling, any real close. It just stood out. I think that was remarkable for me anyway. And the mother was not noted by people who knew her, from a variety of sources, to be an affectionate person. There was no hugging, no caressing. No terms of endearment, no calling Eric honey, those kinds of things, which seem rather simple, but again, it sets the stage, I think, for the cumulative effect of a child who had no opportunity to really attach.
Do you recall the testimony of Mrs. Baralt, I believe it was, who indicated that she saw no active nurturance by Kitty Menendez towards either of her children?
Yes, I did.
And what happens to a child that does not get, we've been talking about the negatives, but let me ask you this, Dr. Tyler. Over the entire course of his life, based on all the information that you evaluated, all the incidents that you looked at, and let me ask you a question here. Do you know about, have you read about, and have you interviewed about far more incidents than were actually testified to in this trial?
Yes.
Over the course of all of what you've read, did you find any evidence of affection, nurturance, demonstrations or expressions of love, regard, support, or positivity by Mrs. Menendez towards Eric?
I did not. Not one report.
And this began in this age 0 to 2, no positive signs of nurturance, affection, or love.
There were a couple of incidents that I pulled from the child's history. Not only did his mother appear to be not available to him in an emotional way.
Is not available a term that means not demonstrating positive
not
emotion?
demonstrating positive emotion, not being there with him emotionally, not connecting. Eric was reported by his aunt that he, as a toddler, I believe before the age he was 18 months, he would leave the house on a very regular basis before his mother was up. And he would cross the street and go to a relative's home, and oftentimes his diaper would be down around his ankles, and his aunt would then call and notify the parent that the child was at their house and mother had not yet missed him. Again, sounds trivial, but a very important message when you're 18 months old.
Is it trivial if when you're 18 months old, in order to get to your aunt's house, you have to cross a public street?
Trivial. That's really not providing safety for the child.
But what does that mean with respect to denying? How is that an example of denying an emotional need? I mean, is this child being mischievous? Is he being naughty? Is he running away from home? I mean,
No, he's just probably waking up and wanting to connect with somebody that's going to change his diaper and give him something to eat. So
Move to strike that answer as being speculative.
Sustain the answer stricken.
well, do you have an opinion based on your understanding of what children under the age of 2 need from their physical environment, particularly when they first get up in the morning, from which you can base why it is this child would go out in the cold, morning after morning, seeking someone else's home?
Objection calls for improper opinion.
Sustain to the form of the question.
Let me turn the question around. You're aware that Mrs. Barral testified this happened about 20 times?
yes,
Now, if a child at that age is allowed to leave the home day after day, 20 times, would that constitute a mother who is not perhaps paying attention?
that constitutes neglect.
And is later on driving recklessly in a car with a 2-year-old who has no seatbelt or safety belt so that he can swing freely from a strap? Is that neglect?
That is neglect.
Is
Also could be terrorization.
Does it endanger the life and safety of a child to allow those behaviors?
Yes,
Is that a sign of love?
it's a sign of neglect, terrorization, disinterest.
Does a child disinterest, is that related to denying emotional needs?
Yes.
And how does the child experience motherly disinterest?
How does a child experience motherly disinterest?
Yeah, if a mother is disinterested, and what does that do to the child?
Well, the message is you don't count. The message is I don't like you. I don't love you. I'm bothered by you.
Are you familiar with the testimony of Mrs. Baralt and her statements that at one point Mrs. Menendez left Eric behind when she went off to look for a new house?
Yes,
And,
that I am.
and what's the significant part of that particular anecdotal information?
Eric was still a very little boy. He was still a baby meaning under the age of 2. And he was left for 3 weeks with Mrs. Baralt. The mother called, as I understand Mrs. Baralt's testimony, very seldom. And the baby was just inconsolable. He was, he didn't understand. He couldn't be comforted.
Let me ask you something. If the information that you've been relying on, that Mrs. Menendez was not nurturing, was not loving, was not comforting of Eric when he was under 2, why would he miss her when she's gone?
Because that was the only mother that he knew, and his attachment was a very anxious attachment.
What does that mean?
Yeah, he
Well-
couldn't predict if and when she would be there for him. And so, and this goes back to the attachment literature, this was a little boy who was a clingy child and was noted also by Mrs. Baralt and others that the way he would go to his mother, he would take her around the leg and cling. And he was anxious about her. He didn't understand that she would go away and come back.
Do little children love their parents even if their parents don't love them?
Yes, they do.
Now, were there behaviors that you characterized as terrorizing on the part of Mrs. Menendez between the age of Eric's age of 0 to 2?
I'm sorry.
Are there behaviors that you characterized as terrorizing? Was there psychological maltreatment under the category of terrorizing by Mrs. Menendez when Eric was under the age of 2?
Well, we talked about the driving the automobile fast and the no seat belts, and mother was never known to intervene or when his father was frightening him.
Do you recall the testimony of Lyle Menendez in which he said that when Eric was little, he tried to join in when Jose was doing his mind thing with Lyle, and Jose would smack Eric aside?
I did.
And are you familiar with the testimony of other witnesses who talked about Jose being physically punitive of Eric when he was very small?
Yes.
And did you come upon any information that Mrs. Menendez ever protested, intervened, or stopped Mr. Menendez from hitting Eric when he was very young?
No, I did not.
Was there behavior that Mrs. Menendez either instigated or apparently condoned that was isolating when Eric was under 2?
Was there an incident that condoned?
No, were there incidents that Mrs. Menendez apparently condoned where Eric was isolated under the age of 2?
Well, one of the incidents that stands out is when he was sent to his room, and it was for, Eric would be sent to his room sometimes for as short a time as an hour or 2 overnight. And at one time, I know that Mrs. Peralt testified that she had, in the witness report I read, she had tried to intervene, and she was told to back off. That
I believe that was the other aunt, Martha Cano.
Martha Cano. Okay. Yes, Aunt Marta.
Your Honor, may I approach for a moment?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, now to move on then, Dr. Tyler, to the next developmental age. I believe you've described that as early childhood, 2 to 6.
That's correct.
And again, we're focusing on the parenting that you're aware of by Mrs. Menendez. And during this age period, did you find behaviors and omissions on her part that constituted denying emotional needs?
Yes, on the 2 to 6 I did. I believe I went through that. I was moving on to the terrorization and the...
No, we were still in 0 to 2.
Okay, it's all right.
Do you recall the information having to do with Eric's early childhood, 2 to 6, that as well as repeating previous patterns such as no hugs, no pet names, that there was no comforting by Mrs. Menendez when Eric was hurt or when he was sick?
Yes, Eric was often left home alone while his mother would take his older brother wherever. And I know there was one incident where Eric left the house. I think he was perhaps 4 or 5, left his house to go find his mother, and she met him out on the highway. She was driving back, and he had been very frightened that she had left him. There was another incident at that age period where when he was being beaten by his father, his mother would turn up the television so that his cries wouldn't alarm her or wouldn't interfere with whatever it was she was doing, but she couldn't respond to it.
Again, is there any information from this age period that she ever intervened to stop Mr. Menendez's physical abuse or other abuse?
No, there was never any information that she would stop his abuse. The other incident that I wanted to address in response to your question was the time, and this was the incident that probably appeared to me to be one of the most significant in this age period, was when Eric was at a swimming pool, and the pool was very, very cold, and he was crying and he wanted to get out. And his mother reached in and grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out and sat him down, and she put a towel over his head.
What was he doing when she put the towel over his head?
He was crying, and he wanted to go home. He wanted to get out of the cold water, and she put the towel over his head and told him that no one would see his crying. And at that point, he said to her, "I'll go back into the pool." And for me, that was very significant, because that message was, There were two messages. It's not okay to be uncomfortable, to cry, to want to go home. But if we go home, I'll tell your father that you couldn't do this like a little man.
Well, what was part of what supposedly happened there that she said, I'll take you home, and then your father will know you cried and didn't continue swimming?
That's it.
And so rather than allow that to happen, Eric got back in the pool.
That's correct.
And what was the message to him in putting a towel over his head to hide his crying?
Well, again, the message is isolation. You know, you cry behind a towel. Nobody sees you. Nobody knows what's going on. You can't reach out for help.
Is there a theme of embarrassment that you detected in the materials? In other words, that Mrs. Menendez was very concerned with being embarrassed by her children?
Well, I think I said previously that image was an extremely important piece of this whole family. It was not what was happening in real life, but it was what they wanted other people to think was happening. And it was very important that people viewed Kitty Menendez as perfection. And if you're a perfect mother, I guess you don't have children that have needs. I'm not sure how that works.
If you're a perfect mother, do you have children who cry at the swimming pool?
I guess not in that family.
Move to strike a speculation, Your Honor.
Sustain, the answer is stricken.
Do you believe that part of the towel incident has to do with this desire on her part to maintain this image of false perfection?
Well, I think that's part of it. But for me, the significance of the towel over the head was reinforcing that isolation, that very pervasive theme that was beginning to demonstrate itself within this family system.
Now, at this same developmental period, are you familiar with Mrs. Menendez's practice of threatening her sons with telling their father lies about misbehavior on their part in order to get them to obey her orders?
In the age period of 6 to 12,
No, we're on
2 to 6.
Mm-hmm. Under terrorizing and threatening punishment, was that one of her methods to use Jose's power to increase her own power with the children?
Yes, and as I talked about earlier, the power base in the family, although it appeared to probably outside sources that it rested in Jose, in fact, I believe that the mother had the power, the most power in this family, because she had her own power over the children, her own need to preserve images, her own way of denying emotional responsiveness, of terrorizing the children, of isolating them. But she also had her power coupled with that of Jose Menendez. And that was a tremendous threat to this child, because she had his wrath, her wrath, his wrath, and their wrath, but their wrath was really carried by the mother. So she was able to use the threat of, I'll tell your father, he'll deal with you.
Well, don't a lot of mothers do that? You know, a lot of exasperated moms with 6 kids who have been breaking windows with baseballs and such all day long say, when your father gets home, I will tell him what you did.
We've all done that, I think.
How is this different than that very normal behavior?
Well, this is very different because there was no respite from this kind of threat. No respite at all.
What does that mean?
Eric knew as a tiny child that no matter what happened, whether he was doing something or not doing something, that his mother had the power to get the father, to invoke the father's wrath, to get the father to deal with Eric.
So is the critical aspect here that she would threaten to get them punished even when he didn't do anything wrong?
That's correct. Throughout the later years, and perhaps you want to wait till we get into that, but it became much more evident how she exploited Eric, how she used Eric to take responsibility for some of her own inadequacies.
You're talking about the incidents where she forgets his tennis rackets, or she makes him late and then she makes him take the blame knowing he'll get hit?
Yes, and then you go on up into, I don't know if you want me to get into this, but graduation and what happens with the car accident, and she's driving and.
Okay. But let's see if we can move through this chronologically so that we can check it off and turn the page. Now, under the category of isolation, are you familiar with the material that both parents drill their children on the I can't think of the word right now because I'm tired. How both of these parents lecture their children on friends and how unnecessary friends are and how limited the role or purpose of friends should be in their lives?
I think probably the example that illustrates that the best is when, but again, this is a little later on, when the boys were competing in tennis or competing in swimming, and they were told that it's really not okay to make friends of other people on the team because you're going to be competing against them. And you can't compete against somebody that you have a friendship with.
Now, are you aware that that lecture was given to Eric by his mother?
Yes.
Okay, you understand Lyle testified that he would hear that from his father, but Eric
heard that from his mother.
And you're aware, are you not, that at age 6, which is part of this developmental period, Eric is already competitively swimming and playing soccer?
Yes, I am. And I am because my notation in this age period talks about the extreme pressure. And when
extreme pressure for what?
The drilling and the pushing and the pressure to perform, the pressure to swim, the pressure to play soccer. And I think the swimming was one of the there were incidents that happened around water, not only with the competition, but also in terrorization in terms of Eric really having some very terrorizing experiences in the water.
We'll get to those when we do the father. That mainly has to do with Mr. Menendez at this age, does it not?
It does.
Okay.
Eric did talk about hating it, hating the swimming, hating the drilling and the pushing, and he'd cry, and then his mother would threaten to tell the father.
Okay. Let's talk about one other aspect from this particular period. Under denying mental, educational, or medical needs, are you aware of the information concerning Mr. Menendez's method of teaching bike riding to Eric, where he pushes him screaming down a hill until he falls off?
Yes, it was on his 6th birthday, I believe, or 5th birthday.
Was it sometime after he was 6?
7th birthday, I don't know, he was still a little boy, had not yet learned to ride a 2-wheel bicycle, and he was given a bicycle, a 2-wheeler for his birthday, and there was a cul-de-sac, as I understand it, on this street, and Eric was told that he must get on the bike, maintain his balance, be able to negotiate, be able to ride around this cul-de-sac without falling. And he tried, I don't know how many times, but he would try it and then jump off as he would get to the cul-de-sac. And he finally was told that if you want to keep the bike, you have to get around this corner. And so he did, and in the process he fell, and he badly had a huge gash on his elbow, I believe it was. And with that, of course, he was hurt and he cried. And the father took the bicycle and took it to the garage and said, when you can learn to ride it around this cul-de-sac, you will have it back. Now, this was a bike the child had been given for his birthday. So it was given to him and he couldn't perform in the way that he was supposed to. So it was taken back. Not only that, but he was hurt, badly hurt when this happened. And I put that under denying medical needs because
Well, let me just stop you for a minute. You're aware of the medical evidence that that injury to his elbow was never sutured, was never treated.
That's correct. That's what I was getting to. It was not treated. So,
and you're aware of the testimony of Alan Anderson that Mrs. Menendez was present when this method of bike riding was being taught and never intervened.
yes.
Did not go to Eric's aid when he fell and was bleeding.
And again, that goes to the theme of isolation. This child could not really effectively go to anyone inside of the family or outside of the family to get his needs met, safety, protection.
Why don't we move now to the middle childhood period, which is 6 to 12. And under this time period, is there a persistent pattern having to do with rejecting and degrading that Mrs. Menendez engages in?
Yes. At this age, it appears that Eric could never do things right. Eric was often blamed for his mother's being late. Eric was left alone in the dark for hours.
Are you familiar from this period with the time that he is, without having to tell the story because it's already been told?
The cake incident.
No, the thunderstorm where he's left alone in Pennington and there's a thunderstorm and he's frightened and the lights go out and he calls a cousin over. Do you recall that?
Yes, I
incident? And do you recall the mother's reaction to his having sought some company in the storm?
She was furious. She was very angry with Eric for doing that.
And to your recollection, was there rejecting and degrading name-calling type behavior that accompanied that?
Yes, she called him a baby and a sissy. And this appeared to be a rather chronic pattern. When Eric would cry, he was called a baby or a sissy.
Dr. Tyler, is there some significance to the notion of chronicity of psychological maltreatment?
Absolutely.
Okay. What does the term chronicity mean in this context?
In this context, it means something that happens time over time over time. It's not an isolated incident. It's not being called stupid one time or even really 5 times. It's on a consistent basis so that the child then internalizes that and feels that he actually is stupid, that he is a baby, that he is a sissy.
In examining and evaluating this mother's verbal interaction and physical interaction with Eric, do you find anything but these negative maltreating behaviors?
Did she ever reward him?
No, I'm saying is based on all the information that anybody could see or give you or give us, was there anything positive that anybody was able to say she did with him?
Well, yes.
What was that?
She drove him to his lessons, his tennis lessons. She drove him to his swimming practices.
Well, let me ask you, how positive is that if he doesn't want to go to swimming practice?
Well, I was trying to think of something positive that she did, not what his perception of that would be.
Well, when I mean positive in a stroking, positive, loving sense. I don't mean an action on her part.
I can't think of anything
You were just scanning the information in your
in
mind.
my head.
Have you ever made note anywhere of any such thing
No, I haven't.
after reviewing all the material? Now, do you believe that everybody remembers everything that happened to them as a child?
No.
Are you familiar with the fact that when Eric Menendez testified, he indicated that there were some negative incidents that other people had testified to that he didn't remember?
I'm aware of that.
And is that common, that we all forget things, both good and bad, that happened to us in childhood?
Yes, it's very common.
And given that all the information that you have concerning Mrs. Menendez's treatment of Eric is negative, is it likely that he has forgotten a lot more negative things than what he remembers?
Objection. Call for speculation.
Sustain.
Would the memory of childhood be so selective that you'd only remember the negative things? Or would you be able to remember positive things if there were any?
Objection. Call for speculation.
Overall.
Children typically remember when you ask a child what their earliest memories are. A child can typically pull out some of the scariest memories and certainly some of the happiest memories. And I think most children, when you interview them, even tiny little children, are able to tell you about a happy birthday party or being taken for an ice cream or some of those kinds of things. So yes, children can report both.
Do you recall interviewing Eric about some of his earliest memories?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall that he did report some happy memories?
I can't bring them up right now.
Do you recall his reporting some happy memories of when he was alone? Memories that only had himself in them and not either parent.
When he was left by himself.
No, when he was out playing, remember trees and birds and flowers.
Yes, I do remember Eric talking about feeling these were his adolescent, young adult words for describing how it was for him when he was little. He did feel connected somehow to nature, to trees, to bugs, to flowers, to those kinds of things.
And did he report, therefore, those kinds of happy memories from early childhood?
Those are the kinds of things that he reported is things that were basically outside of the purview of his family.
Now, returning to this middle childhood period of 6 to 12, under the category of rejecting and degrading, are you familiar with the information concerning how Mrs. Menendez dealt with Eric's learning and school performance?
Yes, I am.
And how would you characterize the way that she dealt with those issues with this child?
Well, he was constantly criticized for his schoolwork, and she would give it to him at home, and then would scream and yell at him over his inability to do the assignment. She called him stupid and she called him dummy. And I remember one incident where he was, and this may have been, no, this was during this age period, he was put in his closet to do his work. And I think he spent the night in that closet doing his work. I remember descriptions of Eric doing his homework and his a writing assignment, and he wasn't, this was a task that he apparently struggled with, and for good reason, it turns out, having looked at that information that arrived today on the learning disability. And he would write something and his mother would look at it and then she'd crumple it up or rip it up and throw it in the wastebasket and tell him to start over. And so homework and lessons and schoolwork must have been a nightmare for this child.
And was there evidence that he was, based on the school records, anxious about his school performance, worried and nervous about it?
Oh, the teachers reported that he was an extremely anxiety-ridden child. And at this time of his life, he was biting his nails to the quick.
Still does.
And
Excuse me, could counsel's comment?
All right, let's just finish your answer, please.
yes, that was noted throughout all of the teacher reports that I reviewed, was Eric's anxiety regarding his performance, and he was very anxious to please the teachers and, of course, his parents, and he would go to the teacher and say, is this okay? Am I doing all right? Is this the answer? And seeking constant reassurance that somehow he was getting it. Those same reports, those school reports, indicated that this was a child, his anxiety was also manifested by, he had terrible stomach aches, and he would often be kept home or sent home, or the school nurse would call because of Eric's stomach aches. And apparently, I couldn't find that there was any medical cause for this. And so would have to assume that this was part of his anxiety over what was going on in his life at home and at school.
Well, if you take a child who is anxious to please, who's anxious about performance, and who has learning disabilities, and your method of teaching him is to yell and rage and scream and destroy his work, does that help?
Doesn't help any child, learning disabilities or not.
And does that kind of parental response in any way diminish anxiety? Does it increase it? What
It increases
impact does
the
it have?
anxiety, of course.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to ask for the daily break, if that's okay with the court.
All right, we'll recess. It's 10 to 5. We'll recess till tomorrow at 9 o'clock.